Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched The Woman King. Let's talk about it. Guys, I am so excited to be sitting here today, finally bringing you guys my review of The Woman King. I know that it's been a while since this film has been out, but I don't care. Quite frankly, I do not care. I don't care if this film is a week old, if it's a month old, if it's a year old. There was no way in hell that I was going to come back to this channel making videos for you guys and not produce a review for The Woman King. There are some films that need a standalone review, and this is definitely one of them. The Woman King was one of my most highly anticipated films of 2022 by far, hands down, and so there was no way I was going to let this month pass without giving you guys a review of it. And on top of all of that, it's also British Black History Month. There's no way I could get away with not making a review for this film, so I can't wait to dive into my thoughts on this one. We're going to be talking about the film itself, the historical context, and I am going to be addressing some of the controversies and the discourse that surrounded this film, especially when it first came out. We're going to dive into all of that good stuff here in this video, but before we get into that stuff, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, guys, let's get into my review of The Woman King. The Woman King is directed by Gina Prince Blythewood, and it centers on the Dahomey tribe. Now, the Dahomey tribe existed in what's now Benin, and they were one of the most powerful tribes, powerful kingdoms in Africa at the time. They were known for having these incredibly powerful warriors who protected the tribe, as well as these incredibly powerful and authoritative kings. We have this focus on the Dahomey tribe at its peak, and one of the reasons why the tribe was able to do so well during this time was unfortunately because of its contributions towards the transatlantic slave trade. So they were basically offering up African bodies for the slave trade. In some cases, they were offering up Dahomey people, their own people, for the trade, but most of the time they were taking prisoners and hostages from enemy tribes that they had captured during wars and conflicts. So in exchange for these African people, the chiefs and the tribes would get, you know, like horses and guns and alcohol, and even those little shells that we often see in like African textiles and statues. They're very valuable. They were considered like a mark of, you know, royalty or a mark of authority and wealth. And so, you know, all of these commodities that the Europeans were able to offer to the African chiefs, they took in exchange for providing bodies for the transatlantic slave trade. And unfortunately, that led to a horrific, you know, crime against humanity that was the slave trade, that led to millions upon millions of African people landing in the Americas and being subjected to horrific, oppressive situations. So most of us will know, I hope, about the transatlantic slave trade, and I don't think you need to know a ton in order to have the historical context needed to fully understand this film. But what's interesting about The Woman King is that it explores the topic of the transatlantic slave trade from a completely different angle. Oftentimes when we see films and TV shows about this era and about this subject matter, it focuses on the slaves themselves. It focuses on the enslaved African peoples who landed in the Americas, especially in the USA, and were made to live in these horrific, dire circumstances. Whereas here we have a story that is based in Africa. It is based in the Dahomey tribe, you know, one of the most powerful kingdoms in all of Africa, and we get to experience this series of events from a completely different lens. And I think that's really powerful and really interesting. As I said before, the Dahomey kingdom was known for having incredibly powerful and fierce warriors, and one of the reasons why they had this reputation was because of the Agogie. Now, the Agogie were a group of female warriors who were basically a part of the king's guard, but they were known, of course, to go on missions to fight against their enemies, and they were known for being fierce. They were known for being relentless, ruthless, like truly warriors, okay? Like, they were compared to the Amazonians of, you know, Greek myth, but they were true warriors here. This is not a group that you want to mess around with. And here in this film, we have Viola Davis portraying the general of the Agogie tribe, Nanishka. Now here, Nanishka is a very world-weary, very well, you know, practiced general. She's seen everything pretty much, and she has led the Agogie to victory time and time again. They trust her and they have their faith in her, and they're very well trained. They know what they're doing at this point when we meet them in 1823. Now during this time, the Dahomey people are on high alert just in general because of the ever-present Oyo Empire. They are looking to kind of breach into the Dahomey lands and take more control than they already have. They see how successful their lands are, and they're looking to take a bite out of that, or even just destroy the entire tribe overall. So we're seeing like the political tensions arise during this time, and I think that's really fascinating because we don't often see the exploration of politics in Africa pre-colonialism. Now we all know that because of colonial era propaganda, a lot of people think of pre-colonial Africa as being the savage lands. You know, people don't consider the culture, the history, the religions, the political tensions of Africa, you know, pre-colonization by European powers. And so here, the fact that we do get to see those aspects be highlighted in this film, the fact that we do have to start to consider the political tensions between the different tribes in Africa, especially in this area at the time, I think is just so amazing, because it cements the idea that Africa is not a monolith, and it has never been a monolith. It has always been a huge continent that is made up of thousands upon thousands of cultures, histories, traditions, peoples, languages. And here we see what happens when some of these groups of people are at odds and they're fighting for power within the region. It's just like when you're at school here in the UK and you learn about England being enemies with Scotland or Wales or Ireland or France. It's so important to realize that those geopolitical tensions existed in Africa at the time as well, because it allows you to see the complexity of these peoples and these civilizations and appreciate the history that was there. And then in the film itself, highlighting the differences and the conflicts between these tribes and kingdoms adds to the tension and adds stakes to the story. Now, whilst the Agogie are technically like the king's guard and they're there to serve the king, we do have this very interesting element where their leader, Nanishka, is starting to doubt the king's actions and the practices that the Dahomey have been using in order to keep their wealth and their success. She's starting to question, you know, how moral, how right it is for the Dahomey to be a part of the slave trade. And you can see the king himself as well is also starting to question these practices. He's not as beholden to those practices as his predecessors were when they saw the huge benefits that they could gain from it previously, to the point where they were more likely to sell their own people in exchange for these commodities. Whereas this current king, King Gesso, played by John Boyega, refuses to sell his own people, but he will sell people from neighboring and enemy tribes. Throughout the film, we do start to see the king himself start to question these practices, just like Nanishka, and they do try to find another way forward. They do try to find a way that they could maintain the kingdom's prosperity without sacrificing, you know, African lives and African bodies to be shipped away for the slave trade. And those are pretty much the two main elements of this story. You know, on the one hand, you have this special forces unit, the Agogie Warriors, who are all female warriors that are just absolutely fierce and powerful and strong. And then on the flip side of things, you have this storyline surrounding the slave trade and the Dahomey's participation in this trade, which has brought them a lot of prosperity, but has also led to a lot of moral questions and a moral conundrum here, which they're starting to face during this time. So first of all, let's address the warrior side of things. This was obviously the part that a lot of us got excited about when we saw the trailers for this film. I think these ladies looked absolutely incredible, and I think Viola Davis gave everything to this role. Literally everything to this role. I cannot begin to tell you how incredible, how empowering, how amazing it was to see these African women in this prestigious unit just completely wipe out their enemies. Like, they were ruthless. This film was not shy about showing the violence and the gore of these sequences, and because it was war, it was a literal war. You know, why hide the fact that these were violent exchanges between these different tribes, and these women really were trained to kill. They were trained to torture and maim and kill and do whatever it took to win on behalf of their king and their kingdom. And I just thought it was incredible to watch. Like, I'm not an advocate for violence, please, but I thought it was incredible to watch, especially because it's based on history. It's historically accurate. And I have to say, I thought every single actor in this unit did an incredible job. I thought Viola Davis gave an amazing performance here. Truly, if she is not a front runner for the Oscars, I don't know what to tell you. I don't want to even bring down the mood with mentioning the Oscars and all of that, because we all know how they run. But I just think she was so incredible in this role. The power that she showed in those action sequences was amazing. I mean, it was just visceral. It was so real. It was so grounded, and it was just so refreshing, you know, in a landscape of, I'm just gonna say it, you know, superhero movies and other, you know, franchise fare that we see, where a lot of action sequences just feel just intangible. They don't have the same impact. Here we have every single swing landing. We have every single hit, every single cut, every single break. You felt it within your bones. It was incredibly done, and I just felt like these warriors really were shown to be the skilled, professional soldiers, okay, killers, that they were in history. It was incredible to see. And the fact that we saw such power and proficiency in their work with these black women, these African women, front and center, was amazing. Name me another film that has incredibly powerful, strong, proficient, intelligent black women taking down the enemy one by one. I guess the only other film that you could name me would probably be Black Panther, but guess what? The Dora Milaje were based off of the Agogie anyway, so I have to say, it wasn't just the violence and the proficiency in killing that I really admired about the Agogie in this film. I would say something that struck me even more, that was more profound in the film, was the sisterhood element. Because here we see a group of women from all different walks of life. You have young girls that were rejected by their family, particularly their fathers, because they couldn't be married off. You had young girls who had gone through horrific trauma. You know, some of them had been violated in all these different ways that I can't really mention here on YouTube, because we know how YouTube works. And then you have other girls who came from other tribes, enemy tribes. You know, they came from all over the place in the region, and they've all come together for this purpose of serving their king and their kingdom and defending the kingdom against the enemy. And they are trained so hard to become the warriors deserving of their reputation amongst their people, and even amongst, you know, Europeans, foreigners who also know of them. You know, they go through this intense training period, which I think was highlighted brilliantly with these incredible sequences, all leading up to this grand tourney, this grand competition. And again, it was just another way of keeping the stakes high and making the film feel more dynamic. There was never a lull in this film, because it knew when to amp up the action. But anyways, back to the sisterhood point. Because we have all of these women and young girls coming from all different walks of life, it was really important to ensure that they bonded together and created this sisterhood that was unbreakable, to make this incredibly strong unit that the Agogie were. And I felt that the exploration of this sisterhood was so compelling in this film. I really felt for each and every one of these women who had gone through horrific, traumatic things in their life previously, but were now eager her to just remake their destinies, to truly take back control of their lives and do something that they felt brought pride and honor to their people. For instance, we have Naui, who's the main character, I guess you would say, in the film, although many of the other side characters do get quite a bit of a feature throughout it. But Naui would pretty much be the co-lead here, and she was the young girl who was offered up to the king by her father because he found her to be impossible to marry off to some old man. She refused to allow that to happen to her, and she was seen as disobedient and a terrible daughter as a result. So she arrives at the Agogie and she is able to rewrite her own story. You know, she is able to rise in the ranks and become this really fierce warrior. Of course, she didn't have to do this alone because she was in this sisterhood, so she had the help of her sisters, and in particular of Agogie, who was able to train her to become this incredible Agogie warrior. Now, I do feel like this emphasis on sisterhood is a reflection of the fact that we're dealing with an African culture, and in Africa most cultures tend to be quite collectivist as opposed to individualistic, which we see in the West oftentimes. So here, instead of just focusing on this one main young protagonist on her hero's journey as she makes her way, trains her way to becoming this powerful warrior, we have this strong emphasis on how she has leaned on, you know, all of her sisters, especially Agogie, to get to where she's at. And I feel like I said, it's very different to what we would usually see in a hero's journey from a more Western film because of the differences in these cultures. Also, I have to say, Agogie was one of my favorite characters, maybe even my very favorite character in the whole film. She was a G. I think Lashana Lynch killed in this film. Well, we'll go back to the Oscars discussion briefly, okay? But I have to say, Viola needs to be up for Best Actress, period. Like, that's not even a question, that's not even a discussion, it just needs to be done pronto. But second up, we also need to have Lashana Lynch as Best Supporting. That's also non-negotiable. Sorry, like, Lashana Lynch destroyed her performance in this film. She was amazing. I loved the character of Agogie, and spoilers, you know, obviously this is a spoiler review, when she died, I was heartbroken. Heartbroken. I was really sad to see her go. But I think the relationship that developed between Agogie and Naui, this kind of sisterhood bond that was pretty much a microcosm of the entire group, I think was really touching. And I think Lashana just added so much to that role to make her really likable, even though she's technically quite problematic. Like I said, the two main parts of the story explore the Agogie Warriors and also the Dahome's contributions towards the transatlantic slave trade. But there are also kind of additional storylines that are explored in this film. The first one being this like huge revelation that Naui is in fact Anishka's daughter. So we find out that Anishka was actually a victim of, you know, violation by an Oyo general, and so she gets these flashbacks when she sees him for the first time in years, and it's just really horrifying and just so, it just made me angry if I'm honest. Like I just even now I'm just like I was so angry when I saw those flashbacks. That there are so many horrible, disturbing scenes in this film that are real, that are rooted in reality, and here we saw her backstory, and it was really heartbreaking. But I had thought that was it, you know, just seeing the pain and the trauma that she comes from, that forged her, that helped forge her into the warrior and general that she is now. I thought that would be it, but no, there is also that added element of her having fallen pregnant, and she was faced with a decision, and she had to leave her child because otherwise she would no longer be a part of the Agogie Warriors, because they're not allowed to have children, they're not allowed to get married or have a relationship with a man at all, and so she would have to have sacrificed that sisterhood and everything that she had worked towards, the honor of being in that group, for the sake of her child. Instead, she got Amenza, portrayed by Sheila Atim, to hide the child away so that no one could find out that she had fallen pregnant and had her daughter. Come to find out many years later that her daughter ended up at her doorstep anyway. So that was kind of like this added melodrama in the story, which I thought was really cool. I feel like it wasn't overplayed, but it was a really important factor of both Nanishka and Naoi's stories, which added, again, just more layers to these characters. So not only do you have the topic of sisterhood being explored, but also motherhood. And then finally, we had this additional storyline exploring Naoi's relationship with Malik. This was the storyline that I personally could have done without. I personally would have removed this storyline from my script, okay? Just because it was giving Pocahontas vibes, and we don't need to revisit that. Like, I have conflicting thoughts and feelings about Pocahontas, okay? But that movie was from a couple of decades ago at this point. We don't need to repeat that history. Now, things do play out slightly differently in this film. It's not a complete remake of Pocahontas, but there's a similar vibes. There's this similar kind of white savior, but he's not white, he's mixed race. So he's half white savior. To be fair, the film does deliberately undercut that storyline. It subverts that expectation by showing Naoi kind of rise up on her own, make her own decisions, and giving her that agency that Pocahontas kind of had in the film. But anyway, so yeah, they do try to go against that trope basically, but I would argue that we could remove the trope entirely. I didn't need the romance in the film. I just didn't think it was necessary. It felt like a studio note, if I'm being honest. Like, it felt like a studio exec being like, okay, but who's she gonna kiss? Like, you ruined it. Now, before we go through more of my thoughts on the slavery storyline and the discourse and controversy surrounding this film, I just quickly want to touch on the more technical elements, because I have to say, I was so impressed. I was so honestly amazed and in awe of Gina and Prince Blythewood's directing in this film. I think she did an incredible job directing this film. I thought it had an artistic flair. I thought the cinematography was amazing. So the cinematographer definitely needs a round of applause. I felt like it felt cinematic. The film felt cinematic. It felt like a film, not a movie, a film, okay? And it is truly so refreshing, especially in this landscape of streaming movies that all feel like they've been made in the same factory, on the same conveyor belt, being pushed out by these platforms, not really giving us the artistic flair and wow factor that we used to see more on the big screen. I feel like this film is just such a breath of fresh air in that landscape. Okay, so now that we have talked about all of the good, the story, the characters, the costumes and score and all of that good stuff, it's time. It's time to talk controversy. It's time to talk discourse. It's time to talk Twitter. First of all, let's establish what this controversy surrounded. Basically, the main issues that people raised when it came to the film was the fact that it focused on the Dahomey Kingdom. Now, the Dahomey Kingdom was known as being very vicious. The warriors were incredibly strong, incredibly powerful, and it did mean that they were able to capture a lot of people to sell off as part of the slave trade. So a lot of people raised this issue and said, well, how can you make this film that glorifies the Dahomey Kingdom when this was their contribution to African history? This is what they did during the time of the slave trade. They were actually part of the problem. Now, here's the thing. I remember learning about the slave trade at school, and I remember seeing like maybe a sentence that addressed the fact that the African chiefs exchanged, you know, the people for goods, for commodities that they sought. And I do think it's a very underplayed part of the slavery discussion, because I personally think people don't even know how to address it, right? It adds a layer of complexity that a lot of people just do not want to deal with. And this film asks you, demands you to deal with it. And I think as a result of that, people were just like, oh, what do I do? Oh, boycott. Like, people just did not know how to address such a complicated issue. It's so much easier when you just see a story about African people during the times of slavery and they are victims. It's so much easier to view them in that light so that you can unequivocally call them the heroes of that story, the good guys of that story. But to see a story like this, where you do have African people in power, in positions of power and authority, exchanging goods with the Europeans in a very, practiced manner, a manner which has gained the African tribe and kingdom a lot of power and prosperity, people don't really know what to do with that. Like, people don't really know how to view these African people then. Are they the heroes? How can they be the heroes? They're contributing towards the slave trade. And to me, this is not a negative of the film. To me, this is a positive. Why? Because this is history. As I said before, Africa is not a monolith, and it never was. And this film is a perfect example of that. We are moving away from looking at these stories from a two-dimensional standpoint. We should be evolving to consider these types of stories in a more complex manner, because that's what they deserve. That's what these African peoples deserve. Remember, they are complex societies. So you have people coming from all different angles and considering the benefits, considering the drawbacks from their own lens, depending on what they stand to gain or sacrifice. So I feel like this film daring to tell this story from such a complicated perspective is not something that deserves to be punished, but rather rewarded, but rather lauded, because it is truly genius and it's daring and it's unheard of, and it makes me excited about the kinds of stories that are being told in Hollywood about Africa, about Black people, and especially about the slave trade era. Having said all of that though, I will say I am very much aware that the discourse surrounding, boycotting this film isn't just about the depiction of the Dahomey tribe and the complicated history of African chiefs selling Black people for the slave trade. It's not just about that, of course. It is also about people who hate seeing stories about Black people, about African people, and especially about African women do well. They hate seeing these stories be depicted on the big screen or at any screen, and they're really angry about the fact that more of these films are being made, so they want to shut this down. And so I'm very aware that there are a lot of just, anti-Black and misogynistic people who are kind of spreading this rhetoric under the guise of actually caring about that historical context. They're like, we see you, okay, because we've been seeing you for this entire year. This has been the year for that sort of action on social media. But yeah, I did also want to acknowledge the genuine and valid critiques of the film that I did see surrounding the historical context and the complicated nature of the Dahomey kingdom. But speaking of the historical context, I did just want to add in a little bit more context for you guys who may have seen those articles about the Dahomey kingdom. I felt like a lot of those articles were not only very one-sided, but also very surface level in the information that they provided about why people had these concerns and why they wanted to boycott the film, supposedly. So I just wanted to add to this information, and I have to say I did not go searching far and wide for this info. Like, I literally did a relatively quick Google search to find out more, and so I think there is really no excuse for journalists, for people who wrote these articles, and for the people who claim to care about this topic on social media. There's no excuse for any of them to have had so little information about the actual subject matter before they went crying on social media about the topic, pretending to care and demanding that people boycotted the film. So first first of all, yes, whilst it is true that the Dahomey tribe were known as being very ferocious and vicious, particularly violent, especially because of the well-trained warriors that they had, both male and female, it must be noted that a lot of the accounts about the Dahomey kingdom were written by European historians or European explorers. And some of these historians or explorers, especially those from the UK, had an agenda, because it was during this time that some of Britain was fighting for the abolition of slavery, and those that were anti-slavery used to use the Dahomey tribe as an example of the, you know, bad Africans, because they were taking part in the slave trade and they were becoming very prosperous as a result of that. These English explorers and writers and historians didn't want to depict them in a positive light. Duh. So they would sometimes exaggerate the depictions of the Dahomey tribe to make them seem like savages, which kind of goes against the anti-slavery messaging, does it not? But here you go, because they were the bad guys, they were still savages, they were still evil. The warriors had to be depicted as bloodthirsty and ruthless, and pretty much the black or African equivalent of the Spartans from ancient Greece. So that was definitely a rhetoric that existed in order to further the agenda of anti-slavery in the UK. And so we can't really take all of the historical accounts of the Dahomey people and the warriors 100% to heart, because there are obviously embellishments and exaggerations there to push an agenda. For instance, a lot of these historical accounts used to emphasize the presence of human sacrifice in the Dahomey kingdom, but in actuality, you know, under King Gezo, this practice was banned because he definitely brought about a lot of changes to the kingdom. And this, interestingly enough, wasn't something that was overtly publicized in these writings. At the end of the day, propaganda is still propaganda, regardless of what side of the political spectrum it's from. And finally, speaking of King Gezo, I did just want to mention real quick that in the film it is highlighted that he wanted to move away from the slave trade. He no longer wanted to take part in it. He had already stopped trading his own people, unlike his predecessors, but he was still trading you know, people from neighboring tribes in exchange for commodities to allow the kingdom to continue to prosper. And in the film we do see the beginnings of the palm oil trade, and that is actually historically accurate. You know, King Gezo did try to steer the kingdom away from the slave trade, and they did turn to the palm oil trade in order to still bring about prosperity and wealth in the kingdom. So with all of that, hopefully I was able to give you guys a little bit more insight into the complex history of the Dahomey tribe, and also kind of give you guys a different perspective on the controversy and discourse surrounding the film earlier this month. But aside from all of that, I still need to give the film itself a score, and when all is said and done, I'm going to be giving The Woman King a 9 out of 10. That's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on The Woman King, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this movie down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.